Lunch and Learn. This afternoon session is entitled Unlawful Harassment, Navigating Harassment Claims and Investigations. And for the record, this presentation this afternoon is being recorded. So if you have objection to being recorded, we ask that you unmute yourself. Take your camera off because this is being recorded. Presenting this afternoon's Lunch and Learn session is Harrisburg Regional Director Heather Roth, SPHR. Heather Roth has been the Regional Director of the Harrisburg office of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission for the last 9 years. Heather has extensive experience in HR. She is a member of the Society of Human Resource Professionals, and she is our resident expert in all matters harassment. Without further ado, Ms. Heather Roth. You're muted, Heather. We can't hear you.
Sorry, you muted me. Just welcome everyone today. I'm happy to be giving this presentation. There's a lot of material to cover, so if you do have questions, perhaps we could put them in the chat and then Tamika could help me address those at the end. Again, we're going to be discussing harassment and really unlawful harassment. Today, we're going to focus on employment, although really the basics of harassment kind of span across the different categories. See, my slide's not working here. Tamika, hold on. I do want to say that we're not giving legal advice today. This is solely for informational purposes. I joke a little bit. I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV or here at PHRC. As Tamika said, I am the regional director. So again, this is for information purposes. If you would have any legal questions or concerns after the training, certainly follow up with your attorney. So for those of you who are not from PHRC that are joining us today, I just wanted to give a very, very brief overview about who we are and what we do. We are Pennsylvania's civil rights agency, and we were established in 1955 with the goal of eradicating unlawful discrimination. We were put in place after a survey revealed that many employers here in Pennsylvania would not hire an African-American employee for really any kind of job. 40, 50, 60% of employers openly and honestly said, no, I don't think I would do that. And we realized here in Pennsylvania that there was an issue that we needed to address. Our agency has a two-part mission. The first is to enforce our non-discrimination laws. We're going to be talking mostly here about the PA Human Relations Act, but we do also have a secondary act, the PA Fair Educational Opportunities Act. The second part of our mission is doing what we're doing today, which is promoting equal opportunity for everybody in Pennsylvania. And we love to do it through this kind of outreach and training. So what do we cover? Our act is very broad. We cover the areas of employment, housing, commercial property, public accommodations, and education. And I have employment highlighted here because that is what we're pretty much going to cover today, harassment in the employment setting. Our agency as a whole receives about 80% of our complaints are employment-based. It wavers between 80 and 85, but it's definitely the predominant kind of complaint that we get. And harassment, as you will see, is one of the major reasons. As far as what classes are protected, you'll hear the term protected class as we go through the presentation. These are the categories or characteristics of folks that are protected under the PHRA. Race and color has been in our act since the very beginning. It was the reason that we were put into place. Our act has been amended more than 30 times over the last so many years to include more and more protections for folks as the state has realized that they are being discriminated against. Sex is included in our act. It includes gender, obviously, male, female, includes pregnancy. And based on recent court decisions, while it's not specifically written in our act, we are looking at discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, as also forms of sex discrimination. Age is covered if you are 40 or over, religion, national origin, your ancestry, disability. Disability is one of the largest basis for complaints that we have. That's a whole nother class that hopefully we'll get to do at another Lunch and Learn. But disability here is very broad. It could be someone with a disability, someone who's had a disability, someone who is regarded as having a disability, somebody that's associated with someone with a disability, someone that uses a support or service animal in certain situations, or someone that handles or trains a support animal. So a very broad category. Familial status is covered in housing. If you have children under the age of 18, you cannot be denied rental or lease, with very few exceptions. A lot of people don't know that. One of the protections that we do have here in Pennsylvania. And retaliation, by far our largest protected class, what we get the most complaints on. For my HR professionals on the phone, it's not your retaliation that happens in general. This is that you have engaged in some kind of protected activity, meaning you've opposed discrimination or perhaps participated in an investigation, and as a result, something negative has happened. Again, that is our largest basis for complaints, and it's often associated with our harassment complaints. So these are our protected classes. As far as our offices, you'll see here we have 3 regions. I hail from the middle region here, the light blue area. Our Pittsburgh area, led by Regional Director Lyle Wood, is out in the dark blue section. And our pink area to the right, who we will be looking for a new regional director, is our Philadelphia area. Our regional offices focus mostly on the intake, investigation, and litigation of complaints. Certainly, we do our share of outreach and training as well. We also do have a central office, which is located here in Harrisburg, and they work on the administrative and public relations pieces of the commission. Our commission has 11 commissioners who provide oversight to the commission, and that is kind of how we are structured. So that's just a little background on PHRC. So let's talk about what really is discrimination, because we hear that word quite a lot. And I think we have to understand what it is to get into the basics of harassment. So discrimination in its general form is some kind of unfair or negative treatment of others. And I think it's important to understand that discrimination happens when people with some form of power, and we're going to talk about what kind of power people might have in this presentation. But those folks with some form of power use it to prevent others, and I put others in quotes because that's generally people who are discriminating see the people they are discriminating against as other and not the same as them. But they prevent them from being treated equally or from getting the same rights and privileges that everyone else has. Discrimination, as you probably know, it happens everywhere. It happens in the workplace, in schools, in housing, even in public spaces. And again, for it to be unlawful for us, it happens because that person is a member of one of those protected classes that we talked about. So let me be clear. Harassment is a form of discrimination. Harassment is a form of employment discrimination, and it violates many, many laws. And it depends on the basis of the harassment. Obviously, harassment, it could be a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. It could be a violation of the Age Discrimination Act. It could be a violation of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's certainly, no matter what the protected class is, could be a violation of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. We're not talking about housing, but I know Director Garcia is on the phone, and I would be remiss to say it's a violation of the Fair Housing Act as well, if we were talking about housing discrimination. So it really spans a very wide course of laws that it could violate. Unlawful harassment under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as I mentioned, it could be the basis of any of those protected classes. So regardless of if the case is filed with us or one of our federal partners, harassment is always going to be a form of discrimination in Pennsylvania. So to give you some statistics, I looked at charges from the EEOC from 2019, which is the last data that we have. And about 36% of the charges that were filed, of all of their charges, had at least one allegation of harassment. That's a lot. For us, it was only about 10%. And you probably would ask yourself, well, why such the disparity? Our Pennsylvania Human Relations Act does not allow for complainants to be awarded pain and suffering in employment cases. I do mention that we do dual file our cases, meaning if it is jurisdictional with the federal government, the EEOC, we will dual file with them, meaning they will adopt our findings. So we do have maybe some room to negotiate, if you will. But generally, our act does not allow for these kind of damages. Folks that file federally may have more remedies available to them. So I do think in cases such as this, where maybe there are not financial losses, which we'll talk about later, sometimes it's more advantageous, at least from the complainant's perspective, to file federally. But certainly your rights are protected here in Pennsylvania. I looked at federal statistics and I looked at our statistics, and it's shocking to me, not really. Things have not changed over the last few years. The top reasons for harassment continue to remain the same. Sex, and we talked about what that includes, race, disability, and age. Both the EEOC federally and here at PHRC locally, we see the same reasons for people being harassed. So let's talk about the basics of harassment. What is harassment? I think, especially in the employment setting, we throw that term around pretty loosely. We joke a lot and say, oh, you're harassing me. But really, in the true sense of harassment, what does that mean? Well, harassment is a wide range of behaviors, which we're going to talk about. It's offensive in nature. Generally, when we're talking about unlawful harassment, the intent of the person doing the harassing is to disturb somebody, to upset them. And generally, for it to be unlawful, it needs to be repetitive. It's typically intentional behavior, which you're going to find offensive or intimidating. And it has to be unwelcome. Why is that important? Well, it's actually the key to harassment. It has to be unwelcome behavior. So if folks are participating in, let's say, inappropriate jokes or inappropriate just overall behavior in the workplace, and they're not disputing it, they're not saying that it's not welcomed, they're actually enjoying it or participating, it's going to be difficult for us as an agency investigating to find that it was unlawful harassment. So unwelcomed is really the key. Who gets to decide if it's unwelcome, if it's hostile, if it's offensive, or if it's intimidating? Well, I'll tell you that one of these answers is always right. One of these answers is sometimes right. And one of these answers is never right. So the person who is the intended target, which would be the victim, is always the one that gets to decide, because they are the one that the behavior is happening to. Every now and then you will have peers and coworkers. Maybe they are not the target of the behavior or the harassment, but they also have to see it, they have to hear it, they have to endure that work environment. So they also might get a say as to what the conduct is doing to them. But under no circumstance does the harasser ever get a say. It doesn't matter what the intent was for the most part. It doesn't matter anything about the harasser. The harasser does not get to decide if their behavior is harassment. It is always the person that is the subject or the people that are also enduring it. We do look, at what is reasonable. Certainly, I think we've all probably encountered someone in our life that we believe to be unreasonable. Maybe someone we work with or we have encountered that they become offended if we don't say hello to them in the morning. That's on one spectrum that's not reasonable. We also probably know many people that could hear the worst jokes or even have behavior directed towards them that is not appropriate, and they're okay with it. They don't mind it. From our perspective, that's also not reasonable. We're looking at what would a person in that same or similar circumstance, how would they feel about the behavior that's going on around them? What would be the norm? What I would say is many people have different norms. Just as an example, a man and a woman, They may have a different perspective. People of different cultures may have a different perspective. So we always want to consider the victim's perspective. We do not want to look at stereotypical notions of what's acceptable. And we certainly don't want to just brush things off because, oh, it's just guys being guys, or it was just girl talk, or things like that. Just because someone says it was harmless, no one got hurt, well, that's again from the harasser's perspective, right? We're looking at it from the victim's perspective. And again, the victim's perspective, we have to be very conscious of changes based on who that victim is. Their life circumstances, their culture, everything about them needs to be considered to say, was this reasonable for them? What factors would actually constitute harassment? Well, you'll see written that we talk about severe, pervasive, and regular. And I want to make it clear that it doesn't have to be all three. Something that is severe, sufficiently offends somebody, humiliates them, degrades them. These are the kind of cases we get where there's physical contact, where someone is threatened, where the behavior is just very vulgar. These are cases where the victim can no longer perform their job because of all of the harassment that's happening. These are cases where the conditions of their employment have been completely altered. We call it a hostile or abusive work environment, which we'll dig into a little bit more. But really what severe harassment does is undermines that victim's personal sense of well-being. And for things that are so severe, it could be one incident. Someone could be sexually assaulted at work, and that could have been the first and only incident of harassment, but that's going to be considered unlawful because it was so severe. On the other hand, maybe the incidents aren't very severe, but they're happening all the time. The behavior is widespread through the company. These are pervasive and regular. So it could be all three, or it could be severe, or it could be pervasive and regular. But no matter what category, if it falls into these, it's going to be unlawful harassment. So when we talk about harassment, what types of harassment are there? Well, we've broken it down into 4 different types to try to make folks understand a little bit more. Physical harassment is probably the most egregious, just based on the nature. Verbal harassment, probably most of what we see in cases. Visual harassment happens, we'll talk about that. And we also have written harassment. Now, we will talk about sexual harassment in a little bit here, but understand that harassment doesn't necessarily need to be sexual in nature. It doesn't need to be based on someone's gender, et cetera. All of this harassment could be based on any of those protected classes that we talked about, and it still would be unlawful. So let's talk about what each of these are. Physical harassment is just as it sounds, physical contact. Examples would be shoving, pushing, hitting another person. Even with no contact, think about somebody that sits in a cubicle and the harasser stands at the entrance to their cubicle and blocks them from moving. They stand in the doorway of an office and they block their mobility. They won't let them exit. That is physical harassment. Of a sexual nature, touching, fondling, patting, pinching, kissing, those things are considered physical harassment. And certainly, and I'm sad to say that we do sometimes get these complaints, extreme forms of sexual harassment could include assault or rape at the job. One of the cases I'll talk to you about today included just that, rape at the job. Some of those physical issues of harassment, they might need to be reported to the police as well. But in terms of harassment, these are all unlawful as discrimination acts. Verbal harassment, again, probably what we see the most. Offensive jokes, slurs, generally racial slurs, name calling, mockery, putting people down, just words of intimidation that interfere with their work performance, and threats. From a sexual nature, it could be demands for sexual favors, propositions, questions about a person's sexual practices, which I'll dig into a little bit more later. Lewd comments, insults. I feel like I might be back on like an 80s movie, but wolf whistles, those kind of things that you see, in movies while Used to be women walking down the street would be whistled at. I think these days we're equal opportunity offenders, men and women. Threats or sexually explicit jokes. These are all verbal harassment. And visual harassment, something we don't think of often, but happens a lot. Offensive objects or pictures being publicly displayed. Think about, and it's a controversial topic, I know, but think about someone with a Confederate flag being displayed at work. Think about things like racial graffiti, nooses. I'm sad to say that we probably get a handful of cases every year where someone has hung a noose at a workplace simply to intimidate an African-American employee that works there. We also see things like swastikas being put on bathroom stalls or even on buildings. So those kind of threatening symbols. And from a sexual standpoint, the X-ray vision, you know, you're looking through somebody, the leering, the obscene gestures, the elevator eyes, looking somebody up and down, displaying sexually explicit pictures at work, calendars in lockers or on desks. Other objects or materials, cartoons, could be emailed, which we'll talk about, but things that are sexual in nature and not appropriate for the workplace. And I have school, but really any place. And then written harassment. We see quite a bit of this. Emails that contain harassing content, letters being put on people's desks or cubicles, notes. And the new one is social media, which is a nuance that we now have to deal with. Social media has provided, unfortunately, a platform for folks who want to harass others to do it quickly, and they can get their message out widespread. We see social media posts where coworkers are harassing each other. I'll give you 2 examples here where you can just see that it's creating a hostile environment for that employer. Posting content that could give the impression of discriminatory behavior. I would say that anyone in a position of supervision or management really does need to be careful about posting things about work. It may not happen while you're at work. It may happen while you're on your own time, but posting things that are going to give the impression that you are discriminating or harassing could be seen as evidence in a case going forward. 2 examples that I had found, which I thought illustrated these points, and I didn't do anything for Pennsylvania because I wanted to keep it a little far from home, but we did have a case in Oklahoma, Hannah versus Northern State University. There were 2 professors talking about a woman who was of Indian descent. I won't read it for interest of not saying the words, but they made posts on Facebook when she was made department chair, and there were other racially charged posts. Certainly for this woman, it created a hostile work environment, and she had stepped down from her chair position. The university knew about the issues and even let those 2 professors who made those comments participated on the committee that voted on her tenure. And when it was denied, obviously this is where the case comes. So there was content showing discriminatory nature and animus in this case. The second case was in Illinois, Meng versus Aramark Corporation. And here there were pictures drawn of this woman on the stall of the bathroom, and they were left there for months. The Aramark employees, including, which is key, 2 supervisors, knew about these drawings. And not only did they not take steps to remove them, but they actually took photographs that ended up getting posted to Facebook, and other employees would see it as they passed the phone around. So these are 2 things where these 2 cases that illustrate how social media could have an impact on harassment cases. So that lends the question of, well, who can be the harasser? And neither one of those cases that I mentioned was it the supervisor. So it's important to know that the harasser does not necessarily need to be the victim's supervisor. It could be, and in many cases it is, but it also could be another supervisor in the area or within the company. It could certainly be a coworker. It could even be someone that's not an employee of the employer, such as a client or a customer. For those of you that work in settings where customers come in, it could be one of them that's harassing your employee. So you have to think about Who brings water if you still have water deliveries? Who fills your vending machines? Do you have outside security that you bring in? Do you have temporary workers? Even though they may not work directly for you, you may still be responsible. They could be the harasser. In some cases, the harasser does have actual power, but not always. We see cases where power is perceived. We have cases where someone is just simply much larger than another person. We have cases where someone may have tenure at the job, so they're kind of seen as someone with a position of power. You have employees who are looked at as more powerful in the workplace because they're popular or they've been there for a long time. So to other employees, they are perceived as having power. So it could be any one of these types of folks that could be doing the harassing. These came from real life cases. Examples of harassment based on protected classes not relating to sex. We had a case where a Hispanic employee was called Pedro. His real name was Fred, and he told his coworkers he did not like being called Pedro, and they continued to do that. They went as far as to have his name put on his shirt, his name being Pedro, not Fred. So that was one example. We had an employee who was repeatedly ridiculed in the lunchroom by his coworkers because they didn't like his type of food. His type of food stinks. No one wants to smell it. No one wants to be around it. This was a national origin case. We had a disability case where a woman who had a speech impediment was repeatedly taunted at meetings because she stuttered, and they would tell her she's not speaking quick enough for the group discussion. And that was something that happened on a repeated basis. And an age case where a man was told he was too old to work, and time after time after time was asked, when are you going to retire? And simply told over and over again that the company wanted new blood. So these are examples of harassment that we have actually seen here at PHRC. So let's talk about the sex-based harassment, because while it's very similar, there are some nuances to it. We see more complaints of sex discrimination, I think largely because of our history. So you think about 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was put into place, sex was a protected class. So we assumed, right, that sexual harassment was unlawful. But it actually took to 1986 to get to the Supreme Court for the first time. So in 1974, a woman by the name of Michelle Vinson worked at a bank, and she was a teller, and she had a manager. And by the way, she was 19 years old. So I want to put that in context. She had a manager who repeatedly sexually harassed her for over 3 years. The court document says that she acquiesced to having sex with this man 40 or 50 times because she felt she had to keep her job. Eventually, she was fired. She had started taking time off just because of the stress, obviously, of the situation. And they fired her, saying it was because she took too much sick time. But this was the first case that made it to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said, yes, absolutely, this form of harassment is protected under the Civil Rights Act. And we move forward from there. 1991, I think, was probably the first biggest media campaign where we started to hear about sexual harassment. For those of you that were around then, Anita Hill came forward and said that Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her many years prior, said that he had made comments that were inappropriate, and that she basically had never reported it because she was afraid of retaliation. I remember back in 1991, it struck me that it was really about whether she it was welcome to her or not. And it really wasn't so much about whether the behavior was bad. And I think we've certainly seen a shift to present day. 2006, I think, was our next big milestone. Taranya Burke using the Me Too on MySpace. She worked with mostly adolescent women of color who had experienced sexual abuse. And her story goes that one day she was talking to one of these girls who had reported to her that they had been sexually abused. And all she could think of was Me Too. And that's really what started that. 2017, it spread virally because Alyssa Milano had used it. Since then, she certainly recognized that that was not her phrase to use. but we had Taranya at one of our symposiums in Philadelphia, and she recognizes too that it actually helped spread her movement. So 2017 was a pivoting point, I think, for us for sexual discrimination and harassment complaints. We made things people more aware that it wasn't acceptable, and there was demand for people to have accountability. What we were missing still in 2017 was that sex discrimination wasn't just about male and female. We were missing that sex discrimination also had to do with sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And last year, June 15th, these 3 cases I have listed here got up to the Supreme Court, and it was determined that yes, discrimination based on those things is sex discrimination. So I think that we are going to see even more complaints of sex discrimination and harassment based on that decision. So the sexual harassment complaint bases can be about gender. Again, that's what we started with. It could be about pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. So all of these things are going to be unlawful harassment. Looking at the number of complaints we get, again, in 2019, EEOC statistics say that of all of the harassment claims they get, about 28% of those claims, almost 29%, were based on sex. And I looked at our data here at PHRC for the same year, and of all of the harassment complaints that we received, 37% were based on sex. So I'm not sure that that's a big disparity that I have to dig in to see what the difference is, but what you're seeing is, about a third of all harassment complaints are still based on sex. So what is sexual harassment? How is it different? We talked a little bit about it, but it's unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and verbal and physical harassment that is of a sexual nature. Again, it's unlawful if it's severe enough. We talked about that creates a hostile or offensive environment where it reasonably affects or interferes with someone's work performance. Sexual harassment is a little bit different, and we're going to talk about this caveat, that it results maybe in an adverse employment decision, or where the submission to that conduct is actually there could be
muted again.
It's okay, I got myself. The submission to the conduct is a condition for the person to keep working. This could be an explicit or an implied threat, but this is something that has to do with sexual harassment. So the 2 different forms of sexual harassment that we'll talk about, the first is quid pro quo, and the second is hostile work environment. So quid pro quo, for you Latin students in the audience today, is simply this for that. It's an express or implied demand for a sexual favor exchanged for some benefit or to avoid a detriment. So think about the examples I have. You will go out on a date with me, and in doing so, I'm going to give you a better review. Or perhaps you will go out on a date with me, or I am going to fire you. So it's either for a benefit or to avoid a detriment. In these types of cases, the perpetrator or the harasser, they absolutely have to be in a position of power. They have to be able to give something or take something if the person does not comply. Things that might change, it could be pay, it could be benefits, it could be their job duties, it could just be keeping their job in general. And the person believes that they must put up with it and that it's a condition of their employment. One thing with quid pro quo that we have to understand is that it doesn't matter if that supervisor or that person in power actually follows through with their threat. The fact that they've made that threat or they've made these sexual demands a requirement for continued employment, it makes it unlawful. So direct thing, sleep with me or else, or indirect, let's talk about your performance evaluation over a glass of wine. These are both examples of how quid pro quo could come about in the workplace. I don't think we get as many of these cases as we used to. Most of the cases we see are more of a hostile work environment, but certainly this absolutely does continue to happen. The hostile work environment, again, it has the effect of creating an atmosphere where someone just can't work. Sometimes we talk about the misery index. How miserable are you at your job because of this harassment? A hostile work environment could change the terms and conditions or the privileges of their employment. Again, it has to either be sufficiently severe or pervasive for it to be unlawful. So things that we're going to ask during an investigation is, how often did this happen? How severe was it? If you think back to the other slides, was it physically threatening? Was it humiliating? Was it offensive? Did it interfere with your work performance? And certainly, what was the context to which this happened? Things that we see, and I don't make this up, these are things that we see in cases, people being teased, spikes, flips, and snaps. What could that be, Heather? Well, think about someone wearing a bra and someone coming up behind them and getting underneath their bra strap and doing things to them. There's spike, flips, and snaps. And yes, we still see that. Rating scales, talking about, who's a 1 and who's a 10 at work. Pinups and posters. Innuendos, suggestive gestures, whistling, embarrassing questions, degrading comments, sexual gossip at work, jokes, graffiti, emails, notes, phone calls, messages, the old ogling and leering, streaking. When I say at PHRC, we've seen it all, I mean, we've literally seen it all. We've had cases where there's been supervisors in the office running guests naked, and we've had employees take pictures. We actually had a probable cause case with those facts. I don't make this stuff up. Pestering, vulgar language, these are all things that could contribute to a hostile work environment. I would be remiss if I didn't add some things specific to our LGBTQ community, because we are seeing more and more harassment based on that. You might see harassment with folks intentionally using the wrong pronouns. Someone tells you what their pronouns are and you choose to use different ones. Barring an employee from the bathroom of choice. Invasive questions about their sexuality. Invasive questions about potential surgeries. Invasive questions about their physical characteristics. And you can kind of conjure up in your head what those questions might be. And as I said, embarrassing questions. These are things that our LGBTQ community often faces and that we see in these harassment cases. One thing I will say, and social context really is key. We're going to look at the severity of the harassment based on that workplace and that workplace culture. Certainly though, regardless of the workplace culture, if someone comes forward and says they are uncomfortable or this behavior is unwelcome, it will not excuse the discriminatory actions. But I give you a lighthearted example just to put it in context. So every day, if you're a sports fan, we see baseball players, football players, they head out to the field, right? And someone gives them a little pat on their behind. And at least as far as PA goes, I haven't gotten any complaints alleging harassment about this. This is what we would call a cultural norm. But if you put that very same behavior into a different context, now we have a complaint. So when I say that social context is the key, we have to think about the workplace. We have to think about what's acceptable there. But again, I can't stress enough that once someone says they're uncomfortable, it now becomes the employer's obligation to fix it, which we're going to talk about. So who's harassed? In most cases, we still see it's men harassing women, and it's not a stereotype. This is what the complaints are telling us. But I do, certainly want to be clear. It's equally unlawful for women to harass men, for women to harass women, for men to harass men. Our statistics are showing increasing complaints in same-sex harassment and in complaints involving LGBT individuals. So, while the standard is still most sexual harassment cases are from women by men, we still get the gamut of everybody doing the harassing, and it's all unlawful. I looked at the EEOC's website, and in 2019, All of the cases filed under LGBTQ was 1,868. Not all of those involved harassment, but I will be curious to see post June 15th, 2020, if those cases increase. But just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. Myths about sexual harassment. These are things that are clearly not true. You'll hear people say, oh, sexual harassment really only affects a few women. Well, it affects more than a few, and it's not just women. People say if the victim would just ignore the harassment, it'll go away. And that's not typically the case. Generally, if it's ignored, it continues. You hear if the victim really wanted to discourage the attention, he or she could do so. And that's not true either. He or she must have asked for it. Most charges are false. Women in particular use these as a way of getting back at a man who they are angry. And sexual harassment is about sex and someone wanting to have sex with another person. Well, let me tell you, if anyone has ever been a victim of harassment, no one's using this to get back at anyone. Filing a complaint of harassment or any complaint is very difficult for the person that needs to do it. So it is absolutely false that people use this as a way to get back at people. And the myth that, I don't want to have sex with that person, so how could I have been harassing them? It's not about sex. It's about power and the use of power. Sometimes it does involve sex and someone actually wanting to engage in sexual activities with someone, but it's about power and the fact that they have it over somebody else. So these are all myths. Examples of sexual harassment that we've seen, accounting manager telling her direct report, if he wants a good review and raise this year, he has to go out on a date with her and always insists that they have their weekly meetings at a local hotel bar. One of the most egregious cases I've seen in my 9 years that I've been here was a sales manager for a large broadcasting company, only hired female salespeople, very, very, very frequently made comments about their appearance and would make sexually explicit jokes. He had a calendar on his desk titled 365 Sex Secrets That Every Woman Should Know. And he used to rip off the pages of that little calendar and put their leads on the back. These women filed multiple complaints, but because he was such a great performer, the company chose not to do anything until ultimately he was reported for sexually assaulting one of his sales reps and ended up with a large judgment against him. So these are two real life examples that we have had. We do need to talk a little bit about what's not harassment, because we do get lots of cases where we have to unfortunately tell complainants what you're describing to us might not be fair, might not be comfortable, but it's not really unlawful. Again, the offhanded comments or isolated incidents, if they're not severe, that's not going to be harassment. Petty slights, simple teasing. We get a lot of cases where someone is claiming nepotism or someone playing favorites because they're simply related, not unlawful. Close supervision or monitoring performance. If someone is having performance issues and there's a justification, that is supervision. That's not unlawful, as long as it's, again, not based on a protected class. We have folks that come to us where they have customers or clients that are just very disrespectful, not based on a protected class, just bad behavior. Consensual behavior in the workplace, not harassment. Extra or unfavorable work assignments, again, as long as it's not based on a protected class, might be poor management or poor supervision, but not harassment. And often we will see poor management or inconsistent policy, but it's inconsistent across the board. And again, not based on protected classes. These are not things that we would consider unlawful harassment. I always think about the meanest, nastiest, hardest to get along with boss that you've had, or the worst coworker, or the worst customer that you've encountered. Not necessarily harassment, again, unless it's based on a protected class, and it has to create a work environment that would be intimidating, hostile, and offensive to a reasonable person. I do, caution employers though, always look at the behavior. It might not be harassment today, but it could end up being harassment tomorrow. So let's address those kinds of behaviors in the workplace so that we don't get a complaint filed later. Some of the reasons people don't report harassment, and it is usually underreported. I saw a statistic at one point that said out of all the harassment that happens in the workplace, only about 10% is reported. So think about the statistics I got from the EEOC website from a presentation they had done. About 85% of people who have been harassed never filed a formal legal charge. So they've never come to us, they've never come to EEOC, they've never gone to any other type of agency like us. And more startling is 70% of people who have been harassed never even tell their employer. So that's pretty startling. That means there's a lot of folks out there that are enduring behavior that they should not have to. People do not report things because they are afraid. It is plain and simple. Many places, when they report harassment, they become the one that's blamed for it. They are retaliated against. They find that the company takes no action or doesn't take an action that actually stops it. Think about as an adult, you're reporting that someone's harassing you. It's kind of like being bullied, right? So it's embarrassing to have to disclose some of these details, especially when some of the harassment is egregious and sexual in nature. It's very difficult to talk about it. Some folks are worried about damage to their career or their reputation. What will the company think of me if I come forward with this? And for some of our LGBTQ folks, there's a fear that if they report that they're being harassed because of those reasons, that they will be outed at work. They may not be ready to let everybody know at work that this is them. People cope with it differently. Some are going to deny it. They're going to block it out. Some will try to avoid the harasser. We unfortunately have situations where they want to confront the harasser. And sometimes that confrontation leads to policy violations. They don't do it correctly. Some folks will joke to diffuse, and I always tell folks that's not the way to go, because then it looks like it's welcome. If you're lucky as an employer, someone's going to file a complaint with you, and you will be able to handle it. But most people that endure harassment at the workplace, they simply quit. And I don't know about the folks on the call, but it is very difficult to find qualified people. So if we have folks that are enduring harassment in the workplace, we certainly want to fix it for them because we want to retain them. So if you're being harassed, or if you are the employee, what should you do? Certainly, if you are able, tell the harasser to knock it off, to stop it. Their actions are not welcome. It is not required, though, because in some cases, it's not feasible to do that. Certainly, if it's possible, report it to human resources, to your union if you're represented, to your managers. I always say, has anyone else had the same issues? Because that could help your case. Ask others. If you're not comfortable maybe confronting someone physically, write a letter or an email. Tell the harasser in writing that this behavior is not welcome, and be specific. We unfortunately get so many complaints where people have complained about harassment, but they don't mention you're harassing me because of my sex, or you're harassing me because of my disability. And sometimes we can't find that it's unlawful if we can't put a protected class to it. Certainly keep a log of harassment and any changes that occur. Make note of anyone that might have witnessed the harassment. These things are so important for our investigators when they're looking at these complaints. If you have been harassed, maybe you need to seek your employee assistance program. And again, as I said, with assault and rape type things, if someone has hung a noose, you certainly want to file criminal charges. Some of these cases might also be hate crimes. So that's a whole different conversation, but I just want to put it out there that these are other options. So if you're the manager or it's your organization, what do you have to do? Well, I want to remind you guys that supervisors are the company. We look at a supervisory employee and say, if you knew or should have known about the conduct, you should have taken action immediately. And that's really important when we talk about liability. But really, the organization has to do two things. They have to take reasonable care to prevent harassment and take reasonable care to correct the harassment. In preventing, we talk about having a good anti-harassment policy that clearly defines what behavior is harassment and clearly says what the consequences are for acting in such a manner. One of the things that we see the most where people fail is they don't enforce the policy. I always say zero tolerance rules sometimes backfire because there can never always be a zero tolerance policy. There has to be some wiggle room based on circumstances, but certainly we need to enforce the policy. Your policy should have multiple avenues for reporting. It shouldn't just be one person. And I'll, in a couple slides, I'll show you why. The policy should be communicated and implemented effectively, and everyone absolutely should be trained. I recommend that everyone is trained on anti-harassment every year to keep your company up to date. As far as managers, they are absolutely responsible. If they see or hear behavior or it's reported to them and it is harassing in nature, they need to address it and correct it. It does not matter if someone says they are offended by it. If the behavior is harassing and inappropriate, it needs to stop. And the managers certainly need to set the example for the workplace behavior. As far as correcting, as soon as something is discovered, it should be thoroughly addressed. I have seen too many cases where it has taken 3 and 6 months for an HR department to investigate an issue of harassment. Meanwhile, they have let the person who is being harassed with that harasser for that amount of time. That is not appropriate. Once the investigation is done, it needs to be appropriate action. And I can't stress enough that the action has to be effective. If the action doesn't correct the harassment and it doesn't prevent it from happening in the future, it was not effective. You have not done your job. And certainly any employee who complains about harassment, whether they are right or wrong, should be protected from retaliation. So when we're looking at these cases and deciding who's liable, really we're looking at just a couple things. Who was the harasser, or is the harasser if it's still happening? Did that respondent, the organization that we're looking at, were they aware of the harassment? For most cases, there's always a caveat. And if they were aware, what did they do, right? So if you're in a situation where your president, your owner, your CEO, one of those highest level people at the company is the one that's harassing the employees, you may as well just write a check, because that company is going to be liable for that harassment. These people are considered as legally called the alter ego or proxy of the company. They are the company. So where would a person report this harassment to? There's nobody, right? Because everybody reports to them. So in these cases, these people can be held personally liable. And in these cases, it doesn't really matter if there was an adverse action to the employee at work or not. Just the fact that they were harassed by someone at this level, the company is absolutely going to be harassed. Or I'm sorry, the company is going to be liable. The next step down would be the manager and supervisor. And the courts have talked about who a manager and supervisor is. Someone that can take what we call a tangible employment action. And it's not just about hiring and firing. It could be, someone that can send them home for the day, someone that can give them a bad performance rating, someone that's in a position of supervision. And we say that they could be vicariously liable for acts of harassment, meaning they are acting as the company as well. As I said in the other slide, they're agents, right, of the company. So their actions or their inactions are going to be key in when we look at these cases. For us to hold you liable for a manager or a supervisor, generally, something bad has had to happen to the employee in addition to just the harassment. Maybe they've been discharged, or maybe they've constructively discharged, meaning they've left because they couldn't take it anymore. Maybe they were demoted, had a change in pay or benefits, those kind of things. We don't assign liability to these supervisors because the liability goes to the company. But I always am cautious to say, people may have counseling, they may have incurred expenses for medication, they may taken sick time, and there may be reasons why this employee has not reported it. We'll talk about this for a little bit, but there's reasons why people don't report harassment. And then the other liability comes with a coworker or a non-management employee. Generally, the company is only going to be liable if, in fact, the employee told the company about the harassment, right? It's only fair that we allow the company an opportunity to correct it and fix it. This would change, however, if we would look into the case and we would see that that respondent has been negligent They have a reporting process that doesn't include someone other than the harasser. So if you only can report it to your manager and your manager is the harasser, well, where do you go? Okay. We've seen that previous employees reported the harassment and they were retaliated against, or other employees attempted to report it, but they weren't allowed to talk to the right person. So all of these things, we would consider. Most of the time, as I said, though, for the company to be liable for a coworker harassing another, they would need to know about it. But there's always a caveat, and you need to be careful that you've been doing the right things. Remedies under the PHRA, certainly we can ask to cease and desist, policy changes and training, and then there could be back pay or front pay for folks who have left the company either on their own or because they've been terminated, costs for therapy and counseling, medication, if they ended up taking a lot of time off because they were stressed about it, maybe they lost pension. We could monitor the company for several years to see how they're handling these kinds of complaints and things like that. What we want to see really is managers and employees getting involved in preventing the harassment in the workplace. Managers need to buy into the fact that it needs to be a harassment-free environment. They need to demonstrate appropriate actions, and they need to demonstrate appropriate behavior. As I said, companies need to have good policies, and they need to follow those policies, and they need to take their complaints seriously. And really, all employees need to be on board. We would love to see that if another employee sees another employee being harassed, that they're not just a bystander, that they jump in and they report it. But that is the only way that we're going to combat this issue in the workplace. I talked only about employment so much, but again, please understand, harassment in housing especially is rampant, and liability for housing, harassment in housing is very different. So that's a whole nother class that we'd be happy to give it another time, but just be aware it's not just in employment. So that is my presentation. I can take any questions. Tamika, any questions?
I'm looking, Heather. I see no questions. We just have great presentation, Heather. Thank you. That's from Adrian Garcia. Heather, what I would like for you to address is severe and pervasive. When we talk about severe and pervasive harassment, like it has to be severe and pervasive in order for it to rise to the level of sexual harassment from a legal standpoint, like by a, from according to a reasonable person. Mm-hmm. So how then does that reasonable person standard apply sometimes? Like, do you understand what I'm asking?
I think so. I mean, I think about it as, in order for us to look at a one-time incident to be unlawful harassment, and I don't want to keep using the word, but it has to be pretty bad. It has to be severe. It has to be something that is so egregious. I think we've talked about in our teams with cases where we have a supervisor who calls one of their employees by a racial slur. How do you get over that, right? That's pretty severe, because now you know how that supervisor feels about you. You have physical assaults. One time is enough. So for it to be a one-time incident, it really has to rise to the level that someone reasonably cannot continue to work in that environment. All the other things, they might not need to be that severe, but they need to be more regular. They need to happen over and over again, which creates an environment that is just intolerable. So that's kind of the difference. And you know what? And sometimes they're all three. Sometimes they're severe, pervasive, and regular. And they're the worst cases that, obviously that we have to investigate, but it can be one or the other. Does that answer your question?
It does, like, because when we talk about people not coming forward and reasons why people not coming forward, in general, it's because people know or they believe that they're not going to be believed. And maybe it was a one-time incident that took place and it was severe to them by their standards, or something that was like very egregious. Mm-hmm. But because it only happened the one time, like the law says that, well, it perhaps maybe does not rise to the level of sexual harassment. So what would you say to a person like that? Like somebody gets cornered in the, in the supply room at the office, and something is said or done to them. This is a one-time incident, but they felt as though that it was severe and it was like emotionally scarring for them. What should they do?
Well, I think under every circumstance, they need to report it to their next available person. You know, if it's a coworker, to their manager, if it's their manager, to their manager's manager, always report it. I would never pass anything off that made somebody uncomfortable as not harassment. It's okay to not be correct that it's not unlawful harassment, but you're reporting behavior that made you uncomfortable. And if you know, go to the company and you're not getting the satisfaction of that it was addressed properly, and that it's continuing, then certainly they should file a complaint with us. Doesn't mean that the investigation is always going to go in their favor, because we're gonna weigh the circumstances in each case, but certainly never stay quiet. Always file a complaint. Never, never, never remain in a situation where you are uncomfortable in the workplace. Never.
So we have a couple of questions, Heather, and some are grouped together, so I'm going to do them individually. Okay. We have a question from one of our investigators, and I'm sure that she's leading us to an issue that she would like to see addressed. So Samantha Lopez asked, if supervisor and employee are in consensual relationship and the employee decides to end it one day, the supervisor begins to retaliate by changing the terms and conditions of employment, would that fall under harassment?
I believe that would be quid pro quo. That means that that supervisor is saying, if you do not remain in this relationship with me, I am going to change the terms and conditions.
So some other questions we have, and these are a little bit more case specific. Is Sam still on? Kelly's on. Is Morgan on?
I can answer the question, Tamika.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly.
Yes.
Did you see?
Yes. Yes, it is. It is considered. It is considered a employer, and also could be a public accommodation as well, since it receives provide services to the public.
So she's referring to the township. So the question was asked about townships, and so I see that Liz did address that a question. We had a question from the Coalition of Natives and Allies. She asked, is a township considered a business? And she asked about, should the township take action to address harassment and racism in the school district? And Liz had answered that question, that the township does not have oversight over the school district. The school district is an entity unto itself. A school district is a place of education, and it is also a place of public accommodation. And so you can, and you have done just that, brought a complaint against them. I want to emphasize what Heather said, and it's so important. And this is where I think, and I don't want to speak for legal, but where I think sometimes we get hung up is that you need somebody to come forward. If you are a person who has been affected, come forward. Like, you don't want to have a victimless crime. And so it's always helpful to get to the essence of the harassment. If you have someone that says, this happened to me, I was affected by this, as opposed to a general or a generic complaint. Now, I'm not saying that that's exactly the case, but that does help. You need to come forward. And it's very difficult. Like, if you've ever experienced any type of harassment, like, believe me, I know, and I don't say that lightly to people, well, come forward. It's difficult to out yourself publicly as a person who has been subjected to harassment. It opens you up to retaliation. It opens your family up to, retaliation, or perhaps the loss of a job, or some type of ridicule in the community. So I understand why people do not often come forward. But in order to make a case, it is very helpful to find that something has actually been done to a person if they come forward and says, it was me, I was affected. If that helps. Kelly, you want to help me out? Morgan? Somebody?
What's the question, Tamika? What do you need help with?
I wanted to address all the questions that were asked, and I did not want to skip over a question. We had the question from, this is the organization, Coalition of Native and Allies, and they are asking the question of, what do I do when my school district is harassing me? And they asked, the question was, should the township take action? And then Liz and myself, we addressed the fact that the township does not have jurisdiction over the school district. The school district is an entity unto itself. You can file a complaint against the school district. And I also was saying that if you have a person who has been a victim, it is always helpful in investigations if a person will come forward to indicate that they are a party that has been aggrieved.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. That's good answer.
Thank you. Let me see, have any other questions? So we have Chris Young. He speaks to harassment, to the types of feelings that it can cause you to have. It can cause you, it makes you feel weak, and to ask for help when you consider yourself a strong person. And so that's another reason why people sometimes don't come forward. Do we have any other questions? Okay, it doesn't appear that we have any other questions. So we thank today's presenter, Heather Roth, for doing an outstanding job of bringing this information forward. We thank everybody for attending today. We appreciate your time, and thank you for once again joining the PHRC for our Lunch and Learn series. We will have another presentation on Thursday, June 24th, and that's going to be our LGBT presentation. And we have a flyer out for that that we have issued, but we will be issuing that again closer to the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.